Iran's response to the American peace proposal arrived without a single word about nuclear weapons. Read that again and understand what it means. Not that the nuclear question was addressed inadequately, not that Iran offered insufficient concessions on enrichment. The response that arrived through Pakistani mediators after several days of deliberate delay, after the IRGC publicly declared it does not pay attention to deadlines, after oil from Kharg Island began leaking into the sea in satellite-visible slicks covering dozens of square kilometers, contained no mention of Iran's nuclear program at all. Zero. The single most important agenda item for the Trump administration, the item that Secretary Rubio has repeatedly described as the central issue on which any deal depends, the item whose physical resolution, meaning the removal of enriched uranium from Iranian territory, Trump has publicly identified as a red line, was simply absent from the Iranian response. What the response did contain was a demand for Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz and a demand for war reparations from the United States. Iran sent a proposal demanding to be paid for the damage done to it and demanding ownership of the waterway that American warships just demonstrated it cannot close. On May 12, 2026, while an oil slick from Kharg Island's failing infrastructure spreads across the Persian Gulf in satellite imagery that every intelligence agency in the world can see, while Iranian drones are flying over both the UAE and Kuwait in the latest test of a ceasefire that has been violated more times than it has been honored, and while Trump is boarding a plane to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping in what may be the most consequential conversation about Iran's future that the current phase of this conflict has produced, the Islamic Republic sent a proposal that was described by the President of the United States as totally unacceptable in terms that left no room for diplomatic interpretation. The negotiation is not failing. It has revealed exactly what the parties actually want. And what Iran actually wants is not a deal. It is a reprieve. And on May 12th, the difference between those two things is the entire story. Let me set the full picture of what has happened in the last 72 hours, because the convergence of simultaneous developments, the Iranian response, the Kharg Island oil spill, the cargo ship targeted off Qatar, the drone activity over the UAE and Kuwait, and the Trump-Xi meeting now on the immediate horizon, is producing a strategic configuration that has not existed at any previous point in this conflict. The Iranian response itself, delivered through Pakistani intermediaries after deliberate delay with no mention of nuclear weapons, but with demands for sovereignty over the strait and war reparations, tells you everything about the institutional logic that is producing it. The IRGC's three-person committee, Vahidi, Zulqadar, and Rezaei, all IRGC origin, none elected, none clerical, all formed in the era when refusing to negotiate, was the natural posture, cannot authorize a response that addresses the nuclear program, because addressing the nuclear program means accepting the elimination of the institutional justification for the IRGC's existence. So the response does not address it. It addresses everything else: sovereignty over the strait, reparations, lifting sanctions, freezing assets, everything that would produce the economic relief that allows the IRGC to reconstitute, rather than the strategic dismantlement that would prevent it from reconstituting. The response is institutionally rational and strategically suicidal because it will be received by a president who has publicly declared that Iran has been tapping America along for 47 years and that the laughing stops now. Trump's response to the Iranian proposal did not include diplomatic language suggesting areas of potential compromise. He said he had read the response from Iran's so-called representatives. He said he did not like it. He said it was totally unacceptable. And in a subsequent post, he described 47 years of Iran laughing at America and stated that the laughing would stop. That is not the language of a negotiation in progress. That is the language of a negotiation that has just revealed its endpoint. Now let me take you inside the Kharg Island oil spill, because it is the most operationally significant development of May 12th and the one that has received the least analytical attention relative to its strategic weight. Satellite images released over the weekend showed an oil slick spreading off the coast of Kharg Island covering dozens of square kilometers of the Persian Gulf. The cause of the possible spill is described in the initial reporting as unknown. The Iranian government denied reports of a spill, with a spokesman telling state-run media that the visible sheen was the result of a discharge from a tanker. The question that this explanation immediately raises is the one that concentrates the entire economic warfare dimension of this conflict into its most precise and most alarming form. How does oil leak into the sea from its storage location if there is still room to store it? That question has a specific physics-based answer, and it is not a comforting one for anyone inside the Iranian oil infrastructure management system. When storage tanks at a terminal like Kharg Island fill beyond their operational capacity, the overflow seeks the path of least resistance. If tanks are full and the system is under operational pressure from continued production flowing in from wells that have not yet been shut in, the excess pressure can produce failures at weak points in the infrastructure, seals, joints, overflow systems, connections between storage and loading infrastructure. The oil that is visible in the satellite imagery as a slick covering dozens of square kilometers is not the result of a tanker discharge, because a tanker discharge would be a localized event with a traceable source vessel. A slick of that geographic scale spreading off the coast of the most important oil export terminal in Iran is the surface expression of a systemic infrastructure failure that the Iranian government's denial is attempting to reframe as something more manageable than what the satellite images are documenting. The storage tanks at Kharg Island are full or overflowing. The geological clock that Trump described with technical precision, the clock that runs on the pressure dynamics and chemical deposition physics of oil that cannot move through its infrastructure, has not just started. On May 12, 2026, it is showing the world its consequences in satellite imagery that covers dozens of square kilometers of ocean. The cargo ship targeted northeast of Doha is the operational context in which all of this economic collapse and diplomatic failure is occurring on May 12th. A vessel operating 23 nautical miles northeast of Doha was struck by an unknown projectile. The explosion caused a small fire that was brought under control. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Agency confirmed the incident. The cause and the projectile's origin have not been officially attributed, but the geographic location and the pattern of similar incidents throughout the ceasefire period make the operational picture sufficiently clear to every maritime risk assessor who is watching. Iran is continuing to test the ceasefire, not with the kind of full-scale assault that the May 7th operation represented and that produced the destruction of Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island's military infrastructure. With the below-threshold harassment that General Kane described as low harassing fire, and that has included 10 confirmed attacks on American forces during the ceasefire period, 9 commercial ships struck, 2 container ships seized, and now Iranian drones tracked over both the UAE and Kuwait simultaneously. The targeting of a vessel near Qatar, a country that recently issued full solidarity statements with the UAE following Iranian strikes, is a specific communication. The IRGC is telling every Gulf state simultaneously that solidarity statements with the American position carry a price in the form of commercial shipping exposure in their own adjacent waters. It is the only remaining instrument through which the IRGC can attempt to fracture the Gulf coalition that has been forming against it. And it is an instrument that Apaches and Seahawks and directed energy systems are making progressively less effective with every engagement. The red line articulation from the American military and political leadership over the last 48 hours is the clearest public communication of the American operational posture that has been produced since the conflict began, and it deserves to be read with the attention of primary source material rather than as background context. The statement that if Iran fires on the United States, the response is destruction, not a diplomatic note, not a protest to Pakistani mediators, not a referral to the war powers resolution, but destruction, delivered in the specific language of "we are going to hit you," is not rhetorical excess from someone who has been asked a bad question. It is the operational description of what has been happening in the Strait since the ceasefire began, and what will continue happening regardless of what any diplomatic track produces or fails to produce. The follow-up elaboration is more specific and more revealing. Iran does not have a navy anymore. What it has are what were described as Little Boston whaler fishing boats used in swarm attacks. The IRGC's sophisticated naval doctrine, the asymmetric swarm strategy built on fast attack boats and drone swarms and coastal missiles that the organization spent decades developing and funding with Iranian national oil revenues, has been reduced in the public assessment of American military leadership to little fishing boats that swarm you and get blown up. That characterization is simultaneously accurate and strategically devastating because it tells the IRGC's institutional audience, the organization whose entire claim to political relevance rests on its military capability, that its military capability is being described by the adversary it was built to deter in the language normally reserved for nuisances rather than threats. Trump's prediction that the hardliners are going to cave is the diplomatic read that the administration is publicly communicating and that deserves examination against the operational evidence for whether it is likely to be correct. The prediction rests on the assessment that the economic pressure being applied through the blockade, combined with the geological damage now visible in the Kharg Island oil spill, will eventually produce a fracture inside the IRGC's institutional consensus that allows the pragmatic faction to prevail over the hardliners. The evidence for this fracture exists. The foreign minister has disappeared from public view after being branded a traitor by the IRGC-linked media for showing negotiating flexibility. The president cannot choose his own cabinet. The supreme leader has been absent for over 5 weeks. The three-front internal war between the IRGC, the mullahs, and the streets is running in real time. And the economic conditions that the oil spill satellite images are documenting, the geological evidence of storage overflow at Iran's primary oil export terminal, are producing the specific outcome that the blockade was designed to produce. The question is not whether the pressure is sufficient to force a cave. The question is whether the institutional structure through which a cave would have to be authorized, the three-person IRGC committee that has no election mandate and no constitutional role but controls every operational decision that matters, is capable of producing the institutional authorization for concessions that eliminate the justification for the committee's own existence. That is not a negotiating problem. It is a structural impossibility. The hardliners do not cave because caving means they are no longer hardliners. The hardliners become irrelevant because the system that sustains them collapses around them. And that collapse is what the oil slick off Kharg Island is the most visible current evidence of. The 5 demands that Iran's response reportedly included deserve the direct point-by-point analysis that their strategic implications require, because each one tells you something specific about what the IRGC believes it can still negotiate toward and what the gap is between that belief and the reality of its operational position. The first demand, keeping part of Iran's nuclear enterprise, is the irreducible institutional demand that no IRGC-controlled Iranian government can concede. The nuclear program is not a bargaining chip to the IRGC. It is the last remaining institutional justification for an organization that has lost its navy, degraded its air force, defunded its proxy network, and watched its Hormuz leverage be systematically bypassed by UAE pipeline infrastructure. Remove the nuclear program and the question of why the IRGC should control 30 to 40% of Iran's economy, why it should govern above the civilian institutions, why it should have the authority to overrule the president and disappear the foreign minister becomes impossible to answer with any argument that survives scrutiny. The second demand, Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz indefinitely, is the demand that most directly reveals the disconnect between the IRGC's self-assessment and the operational record of the last 3 months. The USS Truxtun, USS Mason, and USS Rafael Peralta transited the strait taking 0 hits. 7 Iranian fast attack boats were sunk in the engagement. American destroyers are currently positioned inside the Persian Gulf. Iranian sovereignty over a waterway through which American warships are operating is not a demand. It is a description of conditions that do not exist. The third, fourth, and fifth demands, unfreezing frozen assets, removing sanctions, and receiving war reparations, are all mechanisms for financing Iranian recovery without accepting the strategic dismantlement that would prevent the recovered Iran from rebuilding the same capabilities that produced the current crisis. They are demands for the resources to start again rather than demands for the terms on which to stop. And they are being made by a government whose oil is currently leaking into the Persian Gulf in slicks covering dozens of square kilometers because its storage infrastructure has exceeded its capacity and is failing under the pressure of oil that cannot be exported. Now let me address the Trump-Xi meeting in Beijing because it is the most significant diplomatic event of May 12, 2026, and possibly the most consequential conversation about this conflict that will have occurred since it began. The strategic logic of what Trump carries into that meeting is not complicated, but it has layers that need to be unwrapped precisely. China is Iran's most important economic partner. 90% of the sanctioned Iranian oil that was reaching buyers before the current conflict's blockade closed those routes was going to China. China was purchasing that crude at $8 to $10 per barrel discounts to Brent price, funding through the discount arrangement Iran's ability to maintain the financial flows that sustain the nuclear program, the IRGC's economic empire, and the proxy network financing that kept Hezbollah and the Houthis operational. Without Chinese purchases, Iran's sanctioned crude has no significant market. Without the revenue from those purchases, the IRGC cannot maintain the economic and military capacity that is producing the current crisis. China is not backing Iran out of ideological solidarity. It is backing Iran because the arrangement provides cheap energy that subsidizes Chinese industrial competitiveness, because Iran's capacity to threaten Gulf stability and distract American strategic attention provides China with operational freedom in the Indo-Pacific and South China Sea, and because an Iran that survives the current crisis and remains obligated to Chinese economic support is a useful regional leverage point that costs Beijing less than any alternative instrument of Middle East influence. Trump understands all of this. She understands that Trump understands it, and the meeting in Beijing is the moment when that mutual understanding is converted from implicit background knowledge into explicit operational pressure. The specific leverage that Trump carries into the Beijing meeting is the leverage of the scenario that China most needs to prevent. If the diplomatic track fails and Operation Epic Fury resumes at the level that Project Freedom Plus describes, and if that resumed operation includes the strikes on Kharg Island's oil infrastructure that multiple analysts have described as the option that removes Iran's ability to finance its own recovery, then China's Iranian oil relationship does not just become less convenient. It becomes valueless. And Iran, whose primary oil export terminal has been militarily dismantled, cannot supply oil to anyone at any price. And an Iran whose economy cannot finance its own recovery, whose Kharg Island infrastructure is destroyed rather than simply blockaded, faces the regime collapse scenario that multiple analysts have described as the outcome that the current strategy is designed to make possible without requiring American boots on the ground. If the regime collapses and is replaced by a government whose relationship with China is not structured around the patron-dependent arrangement that the current regime provides, China loses its Middle East foothold. It loses the sanctioned oil discount. It loses the leverage of an Iran-shaped problem that consumes American strategic attention. And it faces a post-regime Iran that may well be significantly more oriented toward the Gulf coalition states and their Western partners than toward Beijing. That is the scenario China most wants to avoid. Trump's leverage in Beijing is his ability to credibly threaten to create that scenario if China does not use its economic relationship with Tehran to force the nuclear concessions that the Iranian response refused to include. The carrot that could accompany that pressure is the one that was raised in the current analytical discussion, and that deserves serious consideration beyond its initial framing. China's economy depends on oil. Approximately 10% of its total energy consumption comes from Iranian crude. 35 to 40% of its imported oil comes from Persian Gulf producers broadly. The American energy production expansion, the drill baby drill policy that has been accelerating domestic production, has created a significant increase in available American crude and liquefied natural gas that could theoretically serve as a substitute for Chinese energy imports that currently come from sanctioned Iranian sources. If Trump offers China the commercial relationship of American energy supply at competitive terms in exchange for Chinese pressure on Tehran to accept the nuclear terms, he is offering something that addresses Beijing's genuine economic need while removing the specific dependency that makes China's current Iran relationship strategically valuable. The challenge with this approach is that the Chinese economy's energy relationship with Iran is not purely commercial. The discount pricing is one element. The political value of having a sanctioned partner that generates American strategic distraction is another. And the Indo-Pacific leverage that Iranian instability provides for Chinese strategic maneuvering is a third. A commercial energy deal with Washington does not replace any of those non-commercial elements, but it makes the commercial component of the Iran relationship less essential, which reduces the total package of benefits that China is preserving by protecting the current regime. Any reduction in China's calculated benefit from the current arrangement increases the leverage that Trump's threat carries. The analysis of what happens if China refuses to apply pressure and the diplomatic track fails completely is the scenario that makes the Beijing meeting consequential in a way that goes beyond a single bilateral discussion. If the war resumes at the Project Freedom Plus level, with Kharg Island infrastructure as a primary target and the IRGC's remaining underground arsenal as the systematic focus of a strike campaign that has already demonstrated its ability to draw those weapons into the open through the May 7th trap operation, then the economic consequences for China are severe and immediate. Iranian oil exports stop completely. The discount pricing arrangement that has been subsidizing Chinese industrial competitiveness ends not with a phase down, but with a physical destruction of the export infrastructure that makes the arrangement possible. The global energy market disruption that is already running at elevated levels from the partial Hormuz closure produces a further shock as the partial closure becomes a complete closure backed by a regime that has been militarily reduced below the threshold of any coherent, organized response. Oil prices spike further. China's import costs increase precisely at the moment that its domestic economy is managing the slowdown that the existing trade pressures are producing. And the regime whose survival China has been protecting by purchasing its oil and providing diplomatic cover at the UN becomes the regime that collapses because its economic lifeline was insufficient to sustain it against the combined pressure of the American blockade and the resumed military campaign. China will have paid the full price of its Iran relationship in disrupted energy markets and elevated import costs without receiving the long-term strategic payoff that the relationship was supposed to provide. That is the loss scenario Trump is carrying into the Beijing meeting. Xi's calculation of whether to apply pressure on Tehran that he has not applied before depends on whether Trump's threat is credible and whether China's Iran relationship provides sufficient benefit to justify accepting the costs of the scenario the threat describes. On May 12, 2026, with the Kharg Island oil slick visible from satellite and Iran's response to the peace proposal sitting on Trump's desk, labeled totally unacceptable, the credibility of the threat is higher than it has been at any previous point in the conflict. The Israeli posture on May 12th adds the final strategic layer to the current picture. Israel is bracing for the possibility that the failed negotiations lead immediately back to military operations that include missile fire toward Israeli territory. The Hezbollah dimension on the northern border, the residual Hamas operational capacity in Gaza, and the broader Iranian proxy network's continued existence as a threat even in its financially degraded state mean that any resumed military campaign in the Gulf creates the risk of simultaneous activation of the northern front as the IRGC attempts to use what it has left of its regional projection capacity to complicate the American and Israeli operational picture. The Israeli Defense Forces' stated readiness across all sectors and immediate response posture for scenarios near and far reflects the specific threat assessment that a resumed campaign could trigger exactly this multi-front activation as the regime's last attempt to change the strategic equation through cost imposition rather than through any realistic prospect of military victory. Israel's communication to Washington that any resumed operations must prioritize Iranian energy infrastructure within the first 24 hours reflects the Israeli strategic understanding that the path to regime fragility that makes a post-conflict political transition possible runs through the destruction of the economic infrastructure that would allow the IRGC to finance its own recovery and reconstitution. If the energy infrastructure survives, the regime can eventually rebuild. If it does not survive, the geological and financial damage that is already running from the blockade combines with the infrastructure destruction to produce an economic environment in which the regime cannot sustain the domestic coercion apparatus that is the last mechanism keeping the population's accumulated rage from becoming the organized political force that replaces the government. The drone activity over the UAE and Kuwait that is being tracked on May 12, 2026 is the operational expression of the IRGC's institutional logic in its current phase. Unable to produce results in the strait against American naval power, unable to win the military confrontation that May 7th's trap operation demonstrated it cannot win, and unable to accept the memorandum's terms without authorizing its own institutional death, the IRGC is conducting the only operations that remain within its operational means without triggering the full resumed campaign that its own generals assess would be catastrophic. Drone harassment, below-threshold strikes, the commercial vessel near Doha, the drones over the Gulf states. Each incident is calibrated to stay below the line that produces a formal resumption of Operation Epic Fury, while demonstrating that the IRGC still exists operationally and can still impose costs on American partners in the region. It is the behavior of an organization that has accurately assessed it cannot win the war, but has institutionally concluded that continuing the war on any terms is preferable to accepting the peace that would end it. And on May 12th, with the Kharg Island oil slick providing the most visible possible evidence that the economic clock has reached its geological phase, the duration available for continuing that institutional logic is measured in days rather than weeks. The red line that was stated most clearly, that threatening Americans results in being blown up and that firing missiles at American ships results in immediate destruction, is the operational framework within which every Iranian calculation about continued below-threshold harassment is being made. The IRGC has been careful to calibrate its current operations below the threshold that triggered the May 7th counter-strikes, but each calibration is producing its own evidence that the calibration is not a strategic adjustment reflecting a changed Iranian position. It is a tactical calculation reflecting a reduced Iranian capacity. The little Boston whaler fishing boats that are all that remains of the IRGC's maritime capability after losing over 120 naval vessels since February 28th are not the weapons that were supposed to be defending Iranian Hormuz sovereignty in the planning documents that the IRGC's naval doctrine produced. They are the residual capacity of an organization that has been systematically dismantled and that is using what it has left because it has concluded that using what it has left is better than the alternative of accepting that what it has left is insufficient to change the strategic outcome. And the American assessment of those boats as little fishing boats rather than a military threat reflects the operational record of every engagement since the conflict began, in which the boats have been sunk or dispersed by Apache helicopters before any of them reached employment position against the targets they were attempting to engage. The Kharg Island situation deserves the specific attention that its geological and economic implications require, because the oil spill visible in satellite imagery on May 12th is not just a headline about an environmental incident. It is the physical evidence that the economic warfare strategy has reached the phase that produces irreversible consequences rather than recoverable costs. Iran's oil infrastructure at Kharg Island, the terminal complex that handles approximately 90% of Iran's oil exports, is operating in an environment where the storage tanks have been filling since the blockade began, and where the outlet for that accumulation has been progressively closed by the American naval interdiction operation. The oil that Iran's wells are producing is going into storage. The storage that was filling throughout April and early May has now exceeded the system's management capacity in the specific way that produces overflow and infrastructure failure rather than orderly shutdown. The oil slick is the consequence of a system that was designed to move oil continuously, that has been blocked from moving it, and that is now failing in the way that pressurized fluid systems fail when their designed flow path is eliminated and no alternative path exists. The geological damage that Trump described, the wax and asphaltene deposition in reservoir rock that permanently reduces production capacity, is the downstream consequence of the system failure that the satellite imagery is documenting. And that damage, once it reaches the threshold of permanent reservoir impairment, cannot be reversed by any subsequent agreement, any lifted sanction, any released frozen asset, or any reparation payment. It is geological. It is permanent. And on May 12, 2026, it is visible from space. Here is the complete picture that the morning of May 12th produces when every simultaneous development is placed in the same frame. Iran's response to the American peace proposal arrived with no mention of nuclear weapons, with demands for sovereignty over the strait that American destroyers are currently transiting, and with demands for reparations from the country that has been responding to Iranian military attacks on its forces and its partners. Trump described the response as totally unacceptable and posted that 47 years of Iranian laughing at America were ending. An oil slick covering dozens of square kilometers has appeared off the coast of Kharg Island, the satellite visible evidence that the storage tanks at Iran's primary oil export terminal have exceeded operational capacity and that the geological phase of the economic damage is underway. A commercial vessel was targeted near Qatar, IRGC drones are flying over the UAE and Kuwait, and the ceasefire that has been technically holding has now been violated by confirmed attacks on American forces 10 times, on commercial ships 9 times, and through an ongoing pattern of below-threshold harassment that is precisely calibrated to the level that produces diplomatic complications without triggering the full military response that the IRGC's operational capacity cannot survive. Trump is on his way to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping in a conversation whose central subject is whether China will use its Iranian economic relationship to force the nuclear concessions that Iran's response refused to include, with the explicit threat that the alternative to Chinese pressure is resumed American military operations that would end Iran's ability to supply China with oil at any price by destroying the infrastructure that makes that supply possible. And the hardliners who Trump predicted will cave are still running the Iranian state through a 3-person committee that nobody elected, whose institutional survival depends on refusing the terms of any deal that would make its institutional existence indefensible, and whose response to the American proposal for ending the war contained no mention of the single issue on which the war cannot end without resolution. The question that concentrates everything on May 12, 2026 into its most essential form is not whether the hardliners will cave. It is whether the combination of the Kharg Island geological event, the failed proposal, the Beijing meeting, the resumed military option sitting on Trump's desk, labeled Project Freedom Plus, and the IRGC's continued below-threshold harassment constitutes the specific configuration that either forces the cave or produces the resumption that makes the cave irrelevant, because the infrastructure that would fund the IRGC's post-cave reconstitution no longer exists. The answer to that question will be written in the next 48 to 72 hours. The Beijing meeting will produce its outcome. The Kharg Island situation will either stabilize or accelerate. The Iranian response will either be revised or stand as the final position that closes the diplomatic track. And the Project Freedom Plus option will either move from the briefing document to the operational order or remain on the shelf for the duration of whatever additional window the diplomatic management of the Beijing meeting produces. Iran sent a proposal that does not mention nuclear weapons and demands sovereignty over a waterway it cannot close. Trump called it totally unacceptable. The oil from Kharg Island is in the sea. The destroyers are still in the Gulf. And the 47 years of laughing have reached the moment that the man who said the laughing stops has been building toward since the first strike package of Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28th. On May 12th, 2026, everything has been said that needs to be said. What happens next will be done rather than declared. Drop your analysis in the comments right now. Iran's response to the peace proposal is the most revealing single document the Islamic Republic has produced since the conflict began, and what it reveals about the IRGC's institutional logic tells you everything about why the diplomatic track has produced near breakthroughs every week for 10 weeks without producing a deal. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the Trump-Xi conversation in Beijing and the Kharg Island geological situation are both operating on timelines measured in hours, and what they produce together in the next 48 hours will determine whether this conflict ends with a memorandum or with the operation that the memorandum was supposed to make unnecessary.